Hello and welcome back to World Religions, a video series to accompany a survey of world religions class, specifically to go along with the textbook A Short Introduction to World Religions by Christopher Partridge, General Editor. Part 5 is on Chinese, Korean, and Japanese religions. We're going to do a separate video for each of these chapters. We're going to start with Chapter 22, Chinese Religions. I've divided this chapter on Chinese religions into 5 main parts. We're going to give a general introduction, followed by a little bit of information on what scholars call Chinese folk religion. This was something not discussed by the textbook, so I wanted to make sure I covered it at least briefly. The textbook mainly focuses on Confucianism and Taoism, and it doesn't give a lot of examples of, for example, gods and goddesses of Chinese religion. So I'm going to do a little bit of that. And then we're going to end off with the section on syncretism, or combining different religions, and kind of like Chinese religions today in the modern world. So section 1, Introduction. We're going to start with a map of the main geographical regions of China to help orient you geographically. Chinese civilization started on the North China Plain along the Huanghe or Yellow River. The river gets its name from a type of silt or loess that has its source in the Loess Plateau further upriver and further to the west. So that was the heartland of Chinese civilization, and then it gradually spread out, especially to the south, later on to the west and north. Chinese religion, traditional Chinese religion now, can be divided into a few main categories. There's a religious tradition that doesn't have a name. It's not an organized religion or sect. Scholars often call it Chinese folk religion. This goes back at least to the Shang dynasty, so around 1600 BC or even earlier. And it overlaps with Confucianism and Taoism. In fact, nowadays, if you go to a a temple of Chinese folk religion, it might just be classified as Taoist. But that classification is a bit misleading insofar as Chinese folk religion is older than Taoism proper. So the picture on the slide is the statue of the goddess Matsu, who's a goddess of the sea, and she would be classified as Chinese folk religion. Confucianism started out as a philosophy or a school of thought around the 6th century BC, named after its founder, Confucius. It evolved religious aspects, especially during the Han Dynasty, but also even as a philosophy, Confucius had a lot to say about religious ritual or ceremony, which he made the center of his theory of morality and politics. So it had a religious dimension to it, even when it was just a philosophy. Taoism also started as a philosophy during the same general period as Confucianism. According to tradition or legend, the founder of Taoism, Lao Tzu, was actually older than Confucius. So you often hear this idea that Taoism, in a sense, predates Confucianism. Historically, Taoism probably emerged a little bit after the time of Confucius, partly as a reaction against or to Confucian philosophy. And within a few centuries, there were religious sects in China that were Taoist in orientation. So it kind of evolved into a religion later as well. So if you want to characterize all 3 of these aspects of traditional Chinese religion, they tend to be polytheistic, that is, believing in many gods. On the other hand, they usually acknowledge one supreme god that rules in heaven. Heaven is called Tian in Chinese, and it's often anthropomorphized as a personal god, which might be titled the Celestial Emperor or the Jade Emperor. Also, different Taoist sects may have different names for the god who rules the universe from heaven. Sometimes Lao Tzu, the author of the oldest Taoist text, Tao Te Ching, is regarded as the heavenly emperor or as an incarnation of the Tao, but still kind of ruling the cosmos, so to speak. Talk about the Tao or the way later. So Chinese religion tends to have a lot of different gods, a lot of different spirits. There's a hierarchy of gods and spirits. but it tends to be very syncretic, which means it combines ideas, beliefs, practices from multiple religions. So it's not at all uncommon, traditionally, for Chinese people to be both Confucians and Taoists and to also practice what could be classified as Chinese folk religion. And you could also add Buddhism into the mix. So the traditional Chinese religion was really mainly a combination of all those three or those four traditions, depending on how you count them. Chinese religion is also sometimes called diffuse religion. That is, it doesn't always have sharp boundaries between the rest of culture or society. That's partly one of the reasons why Chinese folk religion is difficult to name or define. And then there have been other religions in China going back to antiquity, even Christianity, Islam, Judaism, a type of Manichaeism, which was a religion that started by the prophet Mani in Persia. So there has been a lot of diversity throughout its history, but the most common religion practice up until modern times would have been a combination of Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and that Chinese folk religion. There's this issue of, with Confucianism and Taoism specifically, whether they are philosophies or religions. Basically, there's a lot of overlap between them, especially in Chinese history. So there's a fuzzy boundary. Confucianism nowadays would usually be thought of as a philosophy or a school of thought in China, but historically it also had religious aspects. There are Confucian temples, for example, and there's a certain liturgy, certain gods or beings that are regarded as worthy of worship within Confucianism. Um, Taoism also started out as a philosophy, but it incorporated belief in immortal beings, like sages or supremely wise people who were enlightened, who attained immortality, who were worthy of worship. So that was fairly early on, as well as having mind-body practices like a form of meditation. There were a lot of concepts developed by Taoist philosophers like yin, yang, and qi. Those didn't originate in Taoism; they actually predate Taoism. You can find yin, yang, and qi or energy in other types of ancient Chinese thought too. But at a certain point in the history of Taoism, they became especially associated with that school of thought or that tradition, and they subsequently entered Chinese religion generally. So there's a couple of terms in Chinese that help mark this distinction between philosophy and religion. Jia means house, family, or school of thought, and jiao means teaching or tradition, and it's more commonly used of religions. So something I didn't mention on the previous slides, in a lot of these slides there's going to be two different ways of spelling the same Chinese term. And this is because there's more than one way of transliterating Chinese characters into the Roman alphabet. So the two main transliteration methods are Wei Giles and Pinyin. Pinyin is basically the one used by the People's Republic of China. It's by far the most common one used today, both in China and in the West. But the textbook mainly uses the older Wei Giles form, which used to be more common among Western scholars. Now it is still giving way to Pinyin as well. But because the textbook uses Wei Giles, I'm going to usually give the Wei Giles spelling first and then the Pinyin spelling after a slash. So there is a way of distinguishing in Chinese between the philosophical and religious sides of both Taoism and Confucianism. So one of the names of Confucianism as a philosophy is Rujia, which means the school of thought of these scholars, Ru. The name usually given to Taoist philosophy is Daojia, the school of the Wei. Similarly, Confucianism as a religion can be called Rujiao, which means the tradition of the scholars. It's named after the scholars, or Ru, because that was the class of people that were a lot of the early followers of Confucius, including Confucius himself. Whereas religious Taoism can be called Daojiao. In the picture is a modern Confucian initiation ceremony. Part 2, Chinese folk religion. We're going to talk about some of the main beliefs of Chinese religion in general. These are shared by Confucianism Buddhism and Taoism, but they're older than either one, and they don't really have a separate name or sect that's organized with its own clergy or scriptures. Rather, they're pretty much as old as Chinese culture or civilization itself. Chinese folk religion is often labeled Taoist. Like if you go to a temple honoring one of the gods of Chinese folk religion, it could be sometimes described as a Taoist temple. Technically, this is incorrect, just in the sense that there's a lot of aspects of Chinese folk religion that do predate Taoism, originating either in the Shang Dynasty or maybe even earlier. The Shang Dynasty is just the earliest part of Chinese history that has a written text to go along with it. There were earlier phases of Chinese civilization too, and the Shang began somewhere around 1600, 1500 BC, around there. So what are the practices of traditional Chinese folk religion? Ancestor worship is a big one. So honoring the ancestors of a family or clan, keeping their memory alive. That's still a custom that a lot of modern Chinese people follow, even if they don't consider themselves religious. They may burn incense before pictures or tablets with the names of their ancestors. Giving offerings to gods or spirits, including sacrifice, divination. The ancient form of divination during the Shang involved bones. Nowadays, astrology and the I Ching or Book of Changes are more common. Performing exorcisms and other types of interactions with spirits. There was a type of person called Wu or Dongji, which means spirit medium. They actually still exist today. There are some Chinese communities, especially like overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, who will have spirit mediums in their temples. These are people who have a kind of personal connection to a god, goddess, or spirit that will possess them and do things for the community, like give them oracles, help them with their problems, etc. So there are actually some texts that are associated with Chinese folk religion. These are kind of on the boundary between literature, mythology, and religion. They're not Taoist or Confucian, though, so if you have to classify them, it would make sense to associate them with Chinese folk religion. The Chu Tzu is the Songs of the State of Chu from around 221 BC. It has a lot of early versions of Chinese myths of creation. It describes mythological creatures, visions of heavenly worlds, and communion between humans and gods. So it's tapping into that older tradition of shamanism or spirit mediumship. But it's one of the earlier texts that shows that tradition. There's also the later Shanhai Jing, the classic of mountains and seas. So Jing means a classic text or book. Shan is mountain and Hai is sea. So this is from the 4th century BC, but it was compiled over a series of centuries, so a lot of it actually dates from a later period, like the Han Dynasty. But it has a mythic history and geography of China before the Qin Dynasty. That is the dynasty actually from which we get the English word China. And it was not the first Chinese dynasty, but it was the first to create a really unified imperial system of government. And that was around the 3rd century BC. But yeah, the classic of mountains and seas has a bunch of different stories and depictions of gods, goddesses, and mythic creatures, like dragons, for example. And so there is no single like official Chinese myth of creation, for example. You see different versions of the creation myths in different texts, and that's kind of true of Chinese folk religion in general. There can be local variants, there can be different versions over time, but there's a kind of overall consistency to the worldview. Like, for example, dragons are often associated with rivers or lakes or seas. They're often associated with bodies of water that they're the god or the spirit of. So the Chinese folk religion has hundreds of different gods and spirits in it, if not thousands. Some of them are local, but there's also like major gods that are sort of worshipped all around China or that have authority over the whole world. You can divide these into three main types. They're usually divided into heavenly and earthly, first of all. Heavenly spirits are those associated with the sky or the heavens. and they're often associated with particular stars or planets or constellations. An example is Chang'e, the goddess of the moon. Also, the Shangdi, the Lord on high, or the celestial emperor would be associated especially with the pole star, which is the part of the sky that doesn't really appear to move around with the other stars. The other stars look like they move around it. So it appears to be the center of the sky, at least from the earthly perspective. Um, and then there's a whole bunch of earthly spirits. So the heaven-earth distinction kind of corresponds to the yang-yin distinction as well, with yang or light energy being associated with heaven, and yin or earth energy being associated with earth. Yin or dark, shadowy energy being associated with earth. And earth spirits include gods of mountains, but also of just parts of the earth, like regions or locales and cities. Tudigong means an earth god, and usually that's the god of a particular place, like the land or even the fields around a particular place. There's also other types of earth gods associated with water, such as gods of rivers, lakes, seas, and they're often associated with storms and the weather. And as mentioned, dragons or long are often associated as presiding over these watery areas. Well, we could also identify a third type of spirit, ancestor spirits. These might be more associated with heaven because they're often thought of as dwelling in heaven and not with the body. Although there's also a belief in traditional Chinese religion of two souls, one of which goes up to heaven, the other stays with the body. And that belief, by the way, also maps onto the practice of Chinese folk religion of having some ceremonies to honor a dead relative or ancestor at their tomb with their body, where their earthly soul dwells, so to speak, and other ceremonies to honor their ancestor that can be done at a home altar, or traditionally in ancient times, each clan had their own altar where they honored their ancestors. And you could think of that custom, because it's not by the grave, not by the physical mortal remains, as kind of honoring the heavenly spirit or soul. But the ancestors are those that everyone would worship, but you would mainly worship those of your own family. But there were these kind of cultural ancestors, if you will. These would be famous generals or kings or emperors or heroes or leaders or scholars. Anyone who contributed significantly to the culture, to the society, might after their death have been regarded as a god-like being or an immortal worthy of worship. So one example of that is Guandi, the god of war, who started out as a human general. So there's kind of a fuzzy boundary in Chinese religion between humans and gods, in that some of the gods, not all, but some of the gods started as humans who were famous, did something amazing, and were kind of promoted to the ranks of God after their death. There's also the concept of a sage or sheng in Confucianism, which is a supremely wise person. In Taoism, they're often called Chun Ren, which means like a perfected or a true human. And these people can also be worshipped after their death and are believed to have either great wisdom or maybe great power too. In Taoism, they also use the word Xian, which means immortal. And there's a belief that some people, not the majority, but many, can, through various mind-body practices like meditation, can perfect or develop their qi or energy so it becomes more spiritual, more shun energy. And then they can effectively transform themselves to an immortal. Lao Tzu, the traditional founder of Taoism, would be an example of that. There's a hierarchy of the gods in traditional Chinese folk religion. So there's usually one god regarded as ruling over the others. This god is called by different names, both during different times and also by different sects. So because Chinese folk religion overlaps with sectarian Taoism, for example, this general concept of the heavenly emperor, celestial emperor, will be found in the different sects, but they might give him a different name or associate him with a different person. So one example of this, probably the most common one, is Yuanqi Tiansun, which literally translated means heavenly or celestial venerable, which means someone worthy of veneration, Tiansun, and of the primeval beginning, Yuan Qi. So Yuan Shi Tianxun is often regarded as ruling from heaven, just as an emperor would rule on earth. This is a god who rules over all the other gods, but also the whole world from heaven. Um, he's also sometimes regarded as having transferred his authority to a deputy of his, UD, which is the Jade Emperor, the Jade ruler. So there are other names for this idea of a supreme heavenly principle. Dai Yi, the supreme one or the supreme unity, is often thought of as the beginning or source of the cosmos, especially in Taoism, but could also be regarded as a kind of creator god that rules over everything. In ancient China, they talked a lot about Tian, which can mean sky or heaven. And Tian could also be thought of as a personal god, as a conscious being who has moral principles, or who is the source of moral principles also for humans, and is kind of governing the cosmos providentially. And then there's a whole hierarchy below the emperor. So first of all, within the heavenly spirits themselves, there's a whole bureaucracy. And you have to know which god to go to based on which bureau or which office they're in. So that will determine what they have authority over. So this concept was modeled after the ancient Chinese imperial system of government, which dates back at least to the Qin dynasty. There were arguably precursors of it before then, because the kings would sometimes appoint officials to help them govern, not just use other nobles who had inherited their position, but appointed positions. So this human bureaucracy was probably the inspiration for the heavenly or celestial bureaucracy. And this also entered into religious Taoism. So you see this in the most ancient religious Taoist sects as well. And then the earthly gods as well have a whole hierarchy. Ho Tu is the main goddess of the earth, and beneath her are the Shan Shan, the gods of the mountains, especially the Wu Di, who are the five emperors of ancient Chinese mythical history, but also they're associated with the gods of the five main mountains, or Shan. And these have associations with the five directions and also the five elements, and there's five colors. There's like a whole host of associations in traditional Chinese metaphysical theory. Rather than the Greek system of four elements, earth, water, air, fire, traditional Chinese philosophy has five elements: earth, metal, water, wood, and fire. And then beneath the gods of the five mountains are the gods of lesser peaks, smaller mountains. Below the mountain gods are the gods of the city, Cheng Huan Shun. Shun is that word that can be translated as spirit or God. It can also mean just anything spiritual. And then there are many other lesser earth gods of each location or region called Tu Di Gong. And there's even more local gods called Di Chu Shun, or landlord gods. So that is spelling out the main hierarchy of the earthly gods. And there's also gods of bodies of water, like seas, lakes, and rivers. The main ones are the four dragon kings, or Long Wang, Long dragon, Wang king, and of them the highest ranking is the dragon king of the Eastern Sea, which is the ocean to the east of China, which, in Chinese history was the largest body of water that they knew. So below the dragon kings would be the gods of lesser lakes and rivers. Another example of a goddess from Chinese folk religion is Shi Wangmu. She's also deeply associated with Taoism. There are a lot of Taoist sects that prioritize her worship. She's a goddess of the Western paradise, Kunlun. Chinese people, especially Taoists, believe that there are on Earth a couple of paradises, Western and Eastern, where immortal beings dwell, including gods, but also humans who perfected themselves and attained immortality. So it's thought of that the Western paradise is where the heaven meets the earth. And she's associated with these peaches of immortality, these magical or mystical fruits that when you eat them make you immortal. So all the beings dwelling in Kunlun are immortal. Her iconography, she's often associated with three small blue birds that will bring her fruits, for example, and a large bird, a phoenix or feng huang, that is big enough to ride, essentially. The phoenix is mentioned in other ancient Chinese texts, including some Taoist ones, but it's not only associated with Taoism. And she's also associated with the tiger, which is the animal of the West. So in traditional Chinese philosophy or metaphysics or cosmology, there are the five elements, and each element is associated with direction, with an animal, and with one or more gods as well as with the color and a bunch of other associations. So Shi Wang Mu is older in Chinese religion than Buddhism is in China. So Buddhism came to China probably around 50 BC, somewhere around there. And they already were worshiping the Queen Mother of the West and other goddesses. But the iconography of the Queen Mother of the West and some of these other Chinese goddesses influenced the way that certain beings in Chinese Buddhism were later depicted. For example, in Mahayana Buddhism, there's a bodhisattva or future Buddha known as Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. In Chinese Buddhism, Avalokiteshvara is referred to as Guan Yin and is usually depicted as a woman, similar to the depictions of Shi Wang Mu. Also, if you look at the way Chinese Buddhists talk about or visualize the Pure Land, which is a realm created by Amitabha Buddha to help save beings from suffering, the description of that is often influenced by the older descriptions of the Western paradise. So I mentioned previously there's multiple creation myths in Chinese religion. They often start not with a being, a reality like God, but rather with emptiness, with nothingness, which is called Wu Ji in the context of the creation story. So this is the emptiness or space out of which the universe came, but especially in Taoism, emptiness is not thought of as purely negative or purely empty because it's also potential. It can take on any form. It can be the source of all forms. So out of the Wu Ji came the Dai Ji, or the supreme ultimate, the supreme unified oneness of positive being. And that subsequently gave rise to everything else. The Dai Ji is often regarded as having caused or given rise to a kind of egg that then developed into a large, gigantic person, the giant Pangu, who's covered in hair, as you can see in the picture. And Pangu, he stretched out and was able to separate the two types of energy or qi, which are the yin or dark and the yang or light. Now, historically, yin and yang apparently were used to distinguish opposite sides of a hill, mountain, or building. So the south side, which tended to get more sunlight during the day because China's in the northern hemisphere, that's just how that works, is called yang. And the north side, which tends to be more shadowy and shady, is called yin. So this was significant for ancient Chinese architecture in terms of if you're going to build a house or a temple or a palace, you're going to want a lot of the doors and windows to face the south, because that way if you're inside the structure during the day, they will get more light and you can do more work in the house. It's just more practical. But out of that practical need for south-facing windows and doors, there emerged this whole body of lore that could be called geomancy or divination based on the earth. It's also part of the basis of feng shui, which is the art of arranging buildings and interior spaces to improve the flow of qi or energy. So all of that dates back to very earliest periods of Chinese history, but you can see those concepts expanded from the literal south or sunny side of a building or mountain and the north or shadowy side to much larger cosmic forces. So yin and yang are believed to be everywhere in nature. Everything that exists is just different combinations of yin and yang. But originally it was just all one lump of being until Pangu stretched out, separating the lighter yang energy, which was pushed above, from the darker, heavier yin energy, which was pushed below. And the yang became heaven and the yin became earth. So Pangu lived for a long time. I think it was like 18,000 years. 18 can be a symbol of completeness. So that's probably the source of that number. But he eventually died, and out of his body was made the rest of the material world. So from his breath came the wind and the clouds. From his blood came the rivers. From his voice came thunder. From his fur became the forests, and from his fleas came the various animals crawling about in those forests. So the last act of Pongu was to create this other obscure being, Hua Shu, who's sometimes described as a demigod. But his main significance is that he created two other gods slash early humans or founders of human culture, Fu Shi and Nu Wa. Fu Shi and Nu Wa are part of the three sovereigns, or San Huang. The earliest period of mythic Chinese history is referred to as San Huang Wu Di, which means three sovereigns, San Huang, and five emperors, Wu Di. So these beings are mythical, but they were a part of Chinese folk religion. So they're basically worshipped as gods or as ancient sages, wise beings. Their traditional dates would have been 2852 to 2070 BC, but they, as far as we know, were not actually historical. So Fu Shi was the first man, if you will, who lived on Kunlun Mountain with his wife and sister Nu Wa. So he created humans, like normal humans, with his wife by giving life to clay statues. But he also taught people how to hunt, how to fish, how to trap. In other words, how to make a very basic living from nature. He's also regarded as having invented the 8 trigrams, or bagua, that are used in the Yi Jing, or Book of Changes, which is the most popular type of divination in China, and which dates back to ancient times. His wife and sister Nu Wa, one of her big contributions is there was this terrible ancient mythical battle between the god Chuan Shu and Gong Gong, and this battle was so violent it damaged the pillars that held up heaven over the earth, and so Nu Wa had to repair those pillars. So she's still worshipped as a goddess in Chinese folk religion and Taoism. And then the last of the three sovereigns was Shun Nong, which means spirit or heavenly farmer. He's regarded as the inventor of farming and of domesticating animals. He also discovered the use of herbs as medicine and taught that to people as well. After the three sovereigns were the five emperors, the Wu Di. And these are beings that were regarded as actual kings or emperors in ancient China. Confucius looked up to them. He regarded them as kind of like ideal models of rulership and as having an almost like mystical harmony with the way of heaven. So they were kind of like the best channelers or funnelers of heavenly wisdom and heavenly virtue into the world, into society. The first is the Yellow Emperor, or Huangdi. He's often regarded as the ancestor of the Chinese people, so the Han ethnicity specifically. He created the social and political order that was inherited by later kings and emperors. So he invented armies to protect the kingdom, laws and punishments, and he also had a mystical or a philosophical side. He was an expert on the elements, and he created alchemy, which allows you to transform material substances but also to give yourself immortality. So I'm not listing all the five emperors, in part because different lists have different emperors on them, but usually these three are included, and they're three that are mentioned frequently by Confucians, for example. Yao invented the game Wei Qi, often called Go in the West. He sponsored astronomical observations, so he provided the basis for traditional Chinese astronomy slash astrology. And he also set this precedent for meritocracy, or appointing those who are most competent or educated to rule, rather than those who just happen to be family members of or friends of the rulers. So instead of his own son, Don Chu, who is a bit of a scoundrel, he discovered one of his ministers, Shun, was very wise, very virtuous, so he passed over his own son and transferred the rulership of the kingdom to Shun. Shun was raised in a difficult family environment. So his father was blind but also kind of clueless and ignorant. His mother died when he was young. His father remarried, but his stepmother was very disrespectful to Shun, bullied him, and she had a son that was Shun's half-brother, who she really cherished, but her son was the one always doing bad things, but she would lie to the father and blame Shun for everything, and he just believed it. But despite all of this adversity, Shun was still respectful and honored all of the other family members, even those who had abused him. So later Confucians looked upon him as a model of xiao, or respecting your elders, respecting those in your family who have authority over you, which is a main Confucian virtue. They also would look back to Yao, as mentioned, as a precedent for a wise king who appointed competent people to help rule, not just those that they happen to be related to. So you can see that even though this mythic history does predate Confucianism, so you could classify it as part of Chinese folk religion, if you will, and yet a lot of the elements of it were taken, and moral lessons and political lessons were drawn from them by the Confucians. By the way, the person who's illustrated on the slide is actually the Yellow Emperor Huangdi. According to tradition, the first dynasty of kings or emperors to rule over China was the Xia. These are not confirmed by modern history, but they do correspond, at least in part, to an ancient Bronze Age material culture called the early Dou culture, which has been discovered by modern archaeologists along the Yellow River. So this is probably the source of Chinese civilization. According to the traditional account, the Xia dynasty was founded by Yu the Great. And Yu the Great had a big problem, which was that the Yellow River, the Huanghe, would flood every year and damage a lot of land and kill people and so on. So he tried to build dams to block the flooding river, but they would just be overwhelmed by the floodwaters, and the same or worse damage would still be caused. And so eventually he was able to solve the problem by creating irrigation canals that led outward from the river, and he also dredged the river so that it would, the water would pile up less. He made sure to dredge all the rivers and all the channels. And this is this kind of idea that you see reflected in some later Chinese philosophy, including Taoism, but also certain strands of Confucianism, of not just trying to directly counteract the force of nature, like trying to hold all that flood water back with a single dam, but to be more kind of like wise and sensitive, to work with the forces of nature. And you're not just letting nature run its course. That can be bad. It can lead to flooding and death. But you're not just trying to fight against it either. You work with the natural forces. In this case, actually benefits society by irrigating a bunch of farmland. So that was just an example of the wisdom of Yu the Great. Later Confucians certainly look back to a lot of these ancient emperors as being models of virtue and wisdom for later rulers. But the Xia dynasty eventually came to an end. The last ruler, Jia, was a tyrant. And according to later Chinese belief, this was basically developed by the Confucians, heaven or Tian will support a virtuous or wise ruler. And the support of heaven is called Tianming, the mandate or the command of heaven. But if a ruler gets especially tyrannical or unjust, then heaven withdraws its support. And so it becomes relatively easy for people to rebel against the ruler. It's not like heaven will necessarily go in and remove the ruler itself, but heaven will cease to sort of providentially align the forces of nature and society behind the ruler, making it easier for a rebel or someone else to take over and establish a more just, a less tyrannical kingdom. And so with tyrant Jia, his rule was ended by Sage King Tong, the founder of the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty does correspond to a period of history, known to modern historians and modern archaeologists as well, because archaeologists have discovered a lot of artifacts of the Shang kingdom, and some of those have writing on them, like the oracle bones, and the writing was eventually deciphered. So this is the beginning of Chinese literature as well, in a sense. So this was another Bronze Age civilization, a successor to the earlier early Do culture, but also arising over the Yellow River. Um, and their method of divination was a big part of their culture and religion, actually. So the king would sponsor divination ceremonies that would be performed by a diviner or a medium. And the diviner would write a question posed by the king on a bone. Could be a turtle shell, could be an ox's shoulder blade. And the way that they would get an answer is by heating up an iron rod, touching it to the bone. The heat would be transferred to the bone, leading to cracks forming. And the random cracks would be interpreted by the diviner, the divination expert, as an answer from the god or spirit. And so we can actually read those are these oracle bones that have survived and see both the question and sometimes the answer as it was interpreted by the diviner is also written onto the bone. So that was a big part of ancient Shang religion, and the king was at the center of it, so they had a religious role as well. The Shang also had these very elaborate, beautiful bronze vessels in which offerings to the gods would be placed. You can see a picture of one on the slide there on the right. The spirits were divided into heavenly and earthly kinds, just like a later Chinese folk religion and Taoism, and they also practiced ancestor worship too. So far as we know, the Chinese folk religion, the main aspects of it go back to the Shang. They might have gone back earlier, but I don't think it's known for sure, just because the older civilizations and cultures didn't leave sort of like a written textual proof of that. So the Shang believed in many gods and spirits, but they had a supreme god called Shangdi, or the Lord on High. This name is still sometimes used in traditional Chinese religion, but usually this figure would be replaced by the Jade Emperor or another similar heavenly sovereign. The name Shangdi, though, is used to translate God in Chinese language Bibles. So there was also an ethical dimension to the Shang's view of the God of Heaven, or Shangdi. The heaven is not just a law of nature or a natural force. It is that, and you can see that view of heaven as well in some later Confucian texts and just later in Chinese culture, that heaven can be like the rhythms, the patterns of the cosmos, like the orderly succession of seasons and of the motions of the stars and planets in the sky. I mean, that's literally like a heavenly principle. But there was a moral dimension to heaven as well. There was kind of a belief that heaven, which would be worshipped only by the king of the Shang, he was the one who worshipped Shangdi primarily. Heaven would help guide the king and was concerned for the welfare of the kingdom and of the people. So it was there's a moral dimension to heaven, and it may have been regarded as a source of morality as well as it was in later Chinese belief. So now we're going to move on to Confucianism, which started as a philosophy or a school of thought by the scholar Confucius and later on developed into a religion as well. So Confucius lived during the later part of the Zhou dynasty, the Eastern or latter Zhou. The Zhou dynasty started in around 1046. The founder of the Zhou dynasty was King Wu, or King One, depending on how you count it. We'll get back to that in a moment. And King Wu was able to take power because the Shang king, Di Xin, lost the mandate of heaven by being really corrupt, by being really tyrannical, and really kind of jaded and hedonistic. So one of the stories told about Di Xin of Shang is that he had this lake of wine constructed so that he could travel about the lake in a boat, and just whenever he wanted to drink of wine, put a cup into the lake and then sip it. And in the center of the lake, there was an island that had a forest of meat on it, where there were all these trees with roasted meats tied to the branches, so we could just kind of idle by and eat some tasty meat. So this is an alleged example of the great excesses and corruption of Di Xin. So there were a series of campaigns and battles waged by the early Zhou kings against Di Xin, and eventually he was defeated in the Battle of Mu Ye by the general Jiang Ziya. He was a king, but also a general in the service of the Zhou kings. In ancient China, there were like many kingdoms, and so there'd be parts of China that would technically be kingdoms with their own kings, but they would be under the authority of the greater king or the emperor. So who were these Zhou kings? The first one is King Wen. Wen means cultured or learned. So he was the one who started the process of overthrowing the tyrant Di Xin, and he did fight some campaigns against him, but he died before the final battle could be won. So the war was taken up by his son, King Wu. Wu means martial or warlike, because he was the one who, with the help of Jiang Ziya, defeated Di Xin of Shang and founded the Zhou dynasty. But he had his father, King Wen, posthumously declared the first emperor of the Zhou dynasty. And this is an example of the Confucian virtue of xiao, or filial piety, honoring your father, honoring your ancestors, and just your elder family members. So King Wu had many brothers. One of his younger brothers was the Duke of Zhou. And King Wu died only a few years after he had united the kingdom, overthrown the Shang, established a new dynasty. So his own son, King Cheng, was too young to fully take over the responsibility of ruling the kingdom. And also, some of King Wu's younger brothers were not loyal to King Cheng, so they kind of formed a rebellion. Some of King Cheng's, three of his uncles were rebelling against him. But one of his uncles, the Duke of Zhou, was loyal, and he helped serve as regent to the young King Cheng, helped him defeat the rebellious uncles, and then he did not selfishly seize power for himself. Rather, when King Cheng was old enough to ascend the throne and with full responsibility, the Duke of Zhou just stepped aside and let him do that. So Confucius really looked up to the Duke of Zhou, regarded him as a real emblem of fidelity, loyalty to your family, and respect for heavenly principle, you might say, or the underlying moral principles of righteousness. He didn't just do what was in his own interest, he put his own interest aside for the sake of his family and for the sake of the kingdom. Also, during the Zhou dynasty, a lot of the classic texts, works of literature that were studied by Confucius and later scholars were authored. Among them was the Yi Jing, or a book of changes. This was a divination manual that had a different method of divination from the Shang. The Shang method of oracle bones died out, and it was replaced by a method of drawing yarrow stalks, a type of plant, where you'd have these stalks or sticks of different lengths, and you would hold them in such a way that you couldn't tell which ones were longer or shorter. You would pull some out and generate a random sequence of long and short stalks. And then this sequence would be interpreted using the guidelines of the Yi Jing. And this is still done in Chinese culture today. It's still the most popular method of divination. And it's also done by some non-Chinese people too. It's spread to the West and other parts of the world. So the Zhou religion appears in broad outlines, sort of like a continuer of that of the Shang. They continue to give offerings to gods and spirits in those elaborate bronze vessels. Some people think that the art of bronze working actually reached its height or epigee during the Zhou dynasty. And certainly Confucius and later generations of Confucian scholars looked back to the early Zhou kings as the wisest, the most virtuous, and their customs and ceremonies, including their beautiful bronze implements, as being something that they should try to recreate or at least admire. So Confucianism has different names. It's named after, the English name comes from the name Confucius, or Confucius, which was the Latin version of the Chinese name of the philosopher Gongfu or Gongzi. This Latin version was created by Jesuits, Catholic priests of the Jesuit order, who in China in the 1600s were trying to spread Catholicism, which they largely failed to do. There are some Catholics in China today, but they became admirers actually of traditional Chinese culture, even of Confucian philosophy, and they translated some of the Confucian texts into Latin. So that's why there's a couple of Confucians like Confucius and Mencius, or Mengzi, who are often known by their Latin names, at least in Western languages. So another name for the school in Chinese is Rujia. Ru is a word that means scholar or scholar official, and it comes from this class of people during the Zhou dynasty who originally were actually experts on ritual and ceremony. So they advised the kings on exactly how to correctly perform ceremonies to honor the gods. But they were also the class of learned scholars, and so they became general advisors to kings on, what their policies and laws should be, and they authored a lot of the texts of the Zhou dynasty. So Confucius was one such scholar, as were his followers, and that's why his school of thought became known as Rujia, or the school of the scholars. It can also be referred to as a religion, and some of the terms for that are Rujiao, Gongjiao, Gong meaning Confucius, and Lijiao, or the school of ritual, Li. So the three most important ancient Confucian philosophers of the Zhou dynasty were Confucius himself, Mencius, and Xunzi. So we'll be talking about each of them a little bit in the following slides. So even though Confucianism started out as a philosophy or school of thought, Confucius, for example, didn't even have much to say about the gods or spirits, except that you should honor them. But he didn't have like a theology or anything like that. It was more of a philosophy of life and a philosophy for rulers of how they should govern. But from the very beginning, it had a religious dimension to it. So Confucius looked up to heaven, or Tian, as a source of moral authority, as a power that should bind even the king. That even though the king had no earthly ruler above them, no human was superior in authority to the king or the emperor, the king should still be governed by heavenly principle. And also, a big element of Confucius's moral philosophy and political philosophy was the importance of Li, which included religious ceremonies. Li can be translated as ritual, but it also means etiquette or custom. So it's any kind of formal pattern of behavior that's regarded as normative or something that's good and correct to follow. And that definitely included religious ceremonies. Confucius thought you had to perform religious ceremonies and with the right attitude of reverence in order to be a good person. And that also the king had to do this as well in order for him to be a good ruler and for society to prosper. And if you look at Mencius, he had a view of self-cultivation, of how you develop your mind, and it included a theory of qi, or mental/physical energy. So qi can literally mean like steam or breath, but it can also just refer to this energy that circulates in the mind and body. It's an important concept in traditional Chinese medicine as well. Like acupuncture involves putting needles along the channels of qi to try to cure illnesses and such. But Mencius, in other words, was talking about this semi-mystical energy as being involved in ethical self-cultivation. And so you could kind of regard that as a quasi-religious aspect of his philosophy. For Xunzi, he was the most rational, the most skeptic, and the least religious in the conventional sense of the ancient Confucians. So, for example, he expressed doubt about whether the gods actually existed, but even he thought you had to perform religious ceremonies because that would develop in you the right attitudes of respect for authorities. And also, he described the mind of the supremely wise person, the sage, in mystical terms, of consisting of a type of penetrating insight that could kind of see or examine all things clearly. There's also this concept of Chongyong, the doctrine of the mean, or harmony or balance, in ancient Confucianism. And as that was developed later, after the time of Confucius himself, the sage or supremely wise person fulfills this kind of cosmic role where he's a conduit of heavenly principle into earth. He's a kind of uniting point between heaven and earth and sort of becomes one with them. You can kind of see that idea implicit in Confucius himself, the way he describes the sort of transcendent wisdom of Yao and Shun and other early sage kings. But that idea was developed by later Confucians. And so another example of the religious aspect of Confucianism is the Confucian temples. Literally, they're temples of learning or education. And historically, most of them functioned both as schools, but also they would have an altar in them. So they were shrines or temples and schools at the same time. Now, practically speaking, their main function was often mainly educational, but there was always that religious dimension to them. You'd have an altar where Confucius or other sages and sometimes other gods would be worshipped. So a bit more about Confucius himself, Gongzi. So he regarded himself not as actually the creator of a political or moral philosophy or worldview. He saw himself as trying to rediscover, interpret, and transmit the principles of the early Zhou dynasty, including their rituals and customs. He looked at the time of the early Zhou kings, King Wen, King Wu, the Duke of Zhou, and King Cheng, for example, and there were others too, as an ideal period of Chinese history. He saw civilization as a good thing, and so that's why he didn't actually look up to the earliest 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, for example, as the height of Chinese civilization as a kind of golden age. Rather, it took historical development for civilization to be built up. So on the one hand, he looked back to the early Zhou dynasty as a kind of golden age, but it wasn't just because it was old. It wasn't the oldest period. Rather, that was the period in which the previous eras of civilization had gradually built up to the point of perfection, and it had only been lost through the corruption, essentially, of some of the later Zhou kings. And so because the Zhou period was the height to which civilization could reach, that's what had to be restored according to Confucius's philosophy. It's rather like how some people in Europe during the Middle Ages and Renaissance would look back to the Roman Empire or perhaps the ancient Greeks as a high point of Western civilization, as something they wanted to try to reconstruct or revive, such as during the Renaissance, for example. That's a kind of analogy here. However, in point of fact, even though Confucius did assuredly transmit ideas and ceremonies from the early Zhou, he also created his own new interpretations of them and probably authored some genuinely new moral principles as well. He had a curriculum or a method for becoming a virtuous person. The goal was to become a virtuous and wise person, specifically a junzi. Junzi was a term that meant son of a lord or son of a vassal, i.e. someone who had some kind of status in the feudal noble hierarchy of the Zhou kingdom. But Confucius changed the meaning of the word. It was no longer just someone who was born into a noble family. Rather, it was someone who made their character noble through education, through self-development. So in the Confucian tradition, this was something that could be translated as a superior man or a cultivated gentleman or a cultivated person. This was regarded as a more realistic goal that people could aspire to and actually meet if they were dedicated. But there was also kind of like a more distant or mystical goal of becoming a sage or sheng. And the idea is very few people in history would be able to do this. Among them was Confucius himself, but he himself looked back to ancient kings like Yao and Shun, or the early Zhou kings, as people who would have risen to the level of sage. So these are people who are not just cultivated, but that are perfected in their wisdom and virtue, the height of human capability. So how do you do this? How do you become a junzi? There are 2 main aspects that Confucius emphasizes: shui or learning, and ritual or li. So his curriculum or process of learning is to study the traditions of the Zhou, especially these texts called the 5 classics, which included the Yi Jing, or a book of changes, but also there was a book of songs or odes that, according to Confucius, had a moral dimension, the way he would interpret them. So these are just works of literature and history from the earlier Zhou period, but Confucius thought if you studied them carefully, you would be able to draw moral lessons from them. And you would also learn by just trying to put them into practice. And there was a social dimension to learning virtue too. You would do it with friends in a kind of community that would correct each other and spur each other on and share what they had learned, etc. And a chunk of the content of what you were learning from the Zhou was their ritual or li, which included both actual religious ceremonies, like how to honor particular gods and spirits, but also general customs. Like one example of them, it was a custom of the early Zhou that whenever you would ascend a staircase, you would actually bow before going up. And what was the purpose of this custom? It was to acknowledge the fact that usually staircases were not that common in the early Zhou kingdom. They would most commonly be present at altars, where you'd be walking up to a high place to honor a god. They were also present in the palace of the king. And so the idea is by bowing before you ascend, you are showing the proper respect to the higher power that you're about to encounter. So this shows you two things. One, Confucius took the details of ceremony very carefully. You might think of him in this respect as being kind of like really sort of fussy or picky, maybe kind of like an ancient version of Miss Manners, so to speak. But actually for him, there's always a deeper moral dimension. It's not just about the outer show of the ceremony. Rather, by performing these ceremonies and following these customs, you will be training your mind, your heart, your shin in Chinese. And that's basically how you can become a good person. So Confucius doesn't give like a specific list of virtues. There were lists of 4 or 5 virtues compiled by later Confucians, but these are some of the virtues that he talks about. The main one is ren, which can be translated as humane or humaneness. It means basically completing or perfecting your human nature. And for Confucius, being humane includes, among other things, being compassionate and caring to others, like acknowledging basically their fellow humanity, having a certain amount of care, a certain amount of respect towards them, especially the ones you have specific relations to, like your family, your friends, your teachers, your students, your rulers, those you have authority over, etc. Another important virtue is xiao, which basically means being filial, being a good son. But in Confucianism, in addition to the virtue of a son respecting their father or parents, it's expanded to mean respecting other members of your family that are older than you or have authority over you. And this is still a big part of a lot of East Asian cultures, in part because of Confucianism, but also just because Confucius's philosophy reflected an even older tradition. He didn't invent filial piety. He was just trying to emphasize it, develop it, perfect it, advocate it as a virtue to others. So in this respect, he really did transmit earlier traditions of Zhou and even earlier dynasties. But you can still see this idea, for example, that the oldest brother has authority over his younger siblings, or even that an older friend has authority or precedence over their younger friends. That's part of, for example, traditional Chinese and Korean culture. Another Confucian virtue is yi, or uprightness. So this means doing what's right, even if it comes at a personal cost to you. Looking at certain actions as beneath your dignity, even if they would benefit you in some ways. There's also sincerity, which includes things like, not lying. So it could be connected with honesty, but also more importantly, just being authentic, not putting on airs, not pretending you're something you're not pretending to be nice or flattering to someone. Being honest, standing by your moral convictions, even at personal cost. And also, even though Confucius was kind of obsessed with the outer form of ritual, he thought that you had to do it with the right attitude of sincerity. So sincerity is also about having your outer actions fit your inner emotions and vice versa. So Confucius, he thought you had to perform religious ceremonies honoring the gods in order to be a good person, and that the king had to worship heaven and earth in order for them to be a good king and for society to function. But he did not teach about the nature or even the names of the gods and spirits. His idea was basically that this was already a part of the culture. He was rather giving a philosophy or a theory of how to approach ceremony and why it's important for both individuals and society. And so most of its philosophy focused on ethics, politics, the ethical significance of ritual, and also a kind of like philosophy of learning or education, such as learning a musical instrument and certain songs to help develop your character as well. Unlike later Confucian philosophers, Confucius did not teach an explicit doctrine of human nature, which was one of the reasons why later Confucians offered a variety of theories of human nature based on what he did teach. Confucius may have edited or contributed to a work called the Spring and Autumn Annals. These were the annual records of his kingdom. That traditional attribution might not be historical, so it's possible he didn't actually leave any texts to us that he personally wrote. But there is a collection of his sayings that was apparently compiled by his students and followers after his death, known as the Analects in English, or the Lun Yu. And this is one of the main texts of Confucianism to this day. For Confucius, the five classics were the most important texts of the Zhou dynasty to study to become a junzi, to become a wise and virtuous person. The first was the Shi Jing, the classic of poetry, a book of odes or poems to be sung. They were both used by the king and by the common people, so they were both songs from the royal court of the early Zhou kings and folk songs. Confucius would often draw moral lessons from a careful reading or contemplation of their meaning. The second classic was the Shu Jing, the Book of Documents, which included important historical records from the early Zhou period. The third of the five classics was the Li Ji, the Book of Rites, which described the rituals and customs of the early Zhou. The fourth was the Yi Jing, the Book of Changes, a divination manual that used a system of hexagrams, which you can see diagrammed on the right. So this was using that yarrow stock method of divination, where you would generate a random sequence of unbroken or broken lines. The unbroken line was associated with yang energy, and the broken line with yin imagery. And you would use these to develop trigrams and hexagrams, so series of 3 or 6 lines respectively, each of which would have an interpretation that was provided, described in the Yi Jing. So you basically generate a hexagram to describe your current situation and try to divine the future or a proper response based on that. And this is still a divination method used in China today. So for the Confucian perspective, the significance of the Book of Changes is that it gives you a kind of code to how the cosmos operates. And so a wise person will understand these patterns, these principles, these forces, and be able to utilize those principles in their actions. And the fifth of the five classics was the Spring and Autumn Annals. These were annual records of the state of Lu, which is where Confucius lived. Indeed, according to Confucian tradition, Confucius authored or compiled these annals. That may not have been historically accurate, but they are an important historical reference from the time period. There was originally 6 classics, and the 6th was a book of music, but unfortunately that was lost at some point in ancient Chinese history. So after Confucius himself, the second most famous and influential Confucian philosopher of all time was Mencius, or Mengzi. So he had a view of human nature that was optimistic. He thought of human nature as tending towards goodness. So he talked about the sprouts of virtue that we're all born with. In a sense, we're given these by heaven or by nature. We have these in us. But the problem is they are not naturally developed. They're not naturally grown. It's like when a plant begins with a seed, or even when the seed develops a little sprout, it is not necessarily, and even not usually, going to develop into a mature adult plant. It needs a lot of care and a lot of circumstances going correctly, like, the right amount of soil, the right amount of water and sunlight, etc., and the right amount of care from a farmer. So by analogy, humans, though we're born with these sprouts of virtue, we have to deliberately cultivate them, like a diligent farmer, in order for them to develop into the mature virtues. Mencius was also the first to come up with 4 main virtues. Later Confucians added sincerity as a 5th main virtue to the list. But for him, the 4 main virtues were ren, which he interpreted as humanity in the sense of benevolence or compassion, uprightness, or yi, filial piety, xiao, and wisdom, qi, which basically means knowing right from wrong. So Mencius had a very moralized conception of heaven. Heaven is the governor of the cosmos, and thus could be equated with natural law in a sense, but is also the source of human morality. It's heaven that conferred the sprouts of virtue on human nature. And this is a quotation from Mencius that kind of illustrates this idea that there is this deep connection between humans and heaven, or just like the world as a whole. Quote, all things are present in me. When I reflect upon myself in all sincerity, my joy is boundless, unquote. So this is a quotation given by the textbook, but the idea is it's supposed to illustrate the idea of a boundless joy, an almost mystic state that a Confucian sage can reach. And also the connection between a wise person, a sage, and all things. Even according to some Confucians, we would usually associate mysticism more with Taoism than Confucianism, but in the person of the Confucian sage, they can perform a kind of cosmic and quasi-mystic role as well. Confucians developed this concept of Chongyong, or the doctrine of the mean or middle point. Confucius didn't use this word, but he had the concept. For example, he talks about how when you're performing a ritual or a ceremony, it's good to have a balance of 2 factors. One, the external form of the ritual, which should be correct and exact, but you can't just go through the motions. If you go through the motions, even with complete precision, but you don't have the proper inner feeling or sincerity to match it, then the ritual will be flawed. Conversely, though, if you have the right inner feeling or emotion, but you're sloppy in terms of the form, that's another error to fall into. So this notion of a balance of inner and outer, or of opposing forces, is going back to Confucius himself, but it's spelled out more and developed by later Confucians. So one way that later Confucians developed this idea is a distinction between 2 states of mind. There's a state of mind before the rise of emotions, where things are in kind of like a natural or primordial harmony or equilibrium. Things are at peace. They're not stirred up or agitated. But after the human mind comes into contact with things of the world, we tend to react with emotions. Now, the idea is not to get rid of the emotions, to totally try to suppress or annihilate them. They, after all, are also connected to or a part of human nature. Rather, a wise person will develop chung, or integrity, by creating a kind of harmony or balance of the emotions. It's different from the primordial state of no emotion, and just a kind of like emptiness or nothingness, if you will, or a kind of simplicity. So it has all of that texture, all of that complexity of the human experience, but there aren't any of these unhealthy extremes, like of extreme anger or extreme fear or what have you. There's this more balance or equilibrium. So this is like an image of, or an idea of how the Confucian scholar is supposed to carefully cultivate their emotions and inward state. And if this is developed sufficiently, then the wise person can even connect to larger forces of heaven and earth. Quote, if they can assist in the transformation and nourishing process of heaven and earth, they can thus form a trinity with heaven and earth, unquote. And that's a quotation from a later text called Chongyong, the doctrine of the mean. So this idea of a trinity of heaven, earth, and the human sage. This would be a rare thing, but the idea is a sage can be a kind of like conduit where heavenly principle is then made manifest across the wider earth. That's kind of the Confucian ideal anyway. The picture is from a modern celebration of Confucius's birthday in the People's Republic of China, but they were kind of reviving this older form of Confucian ceremony. So the third most famous ancient Confucian, this is from the Zhou dynasty period, is Xunzi. And he's different from Mengzi in being a bit more of a pessimist about human nature, but also different from other Confucians from being more of a quote-unquote rationalist. That is, for example, he appears to be skeptical or at least agnostic about whether gods and spirits actually exist. And he emphasizes the practical side of Confucianism, that it's not just about worshiping or honoring these transcendent beings or principles like heaven, but rather following the Confucian philosophy will produce visible, tangible benefits for both individuals, families, and societies in the here and now, the observable world. So even though Xunzi expresses skepticism about whether gods and spirits exist, he agrees completely with Confucius about the importance of ritual, because ritual is just how humans can train themselves to be virtuous. In a religious ritual, you are honoring a god or spirit who's above you, and you're giving them offerings, something of value. So you're kind of acting out this general moral principle that you, the self or the ego, is not the most important principle, that there are things of higher value outside of yourself. So Xunzi taught that people must believe in gods regardless of whether they exist in order for them to become virtuous and also for there to be order in society. So this is a functionalist view of religion and ritual, that it has a social benefit, it creates social order. His view of human nature is kind of the opposite of Mencius, where Mencius thought that we're born with these sprouts of virtue and that our human nature, in a sense, is designed for, or at least as if designed for, virtue. That is the fulfillment of our human nature. It's what our nature wants to become, just like a sprout of a plant wants to become a full-grown plant in some sense. But that was not the view of Xunzi. He thought that by nature we're just completely self-interested. And in fact, the genius of society and ritual and custom and culture is that it goes against human nature. But this is a good thing, because by going against our human nature, we are becoming better persons. We're controlling the selfishness in a way that will, in the long run, allow all of us to benefit. And so this is often compared to the moral and political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century English political philosopher, who also believed that humans were naturally self-interested, but they can create a government for mutual self-interest by establishing one person as the sovereign. But even though Xunzi didn't necessarily have that social contract theory of morality or politics, he shared the view of human nature, and that there's definitely a benefit to individuals by having a social order and a sovereign, even if it's not established by a kind of literal social contract. And Xunzi also differs from Hobbes in really emphasizing the necessity for ritual, both to create individual morality and the social order. So Xunzi talks about heaven, but in his thought, and that of some other later Confucians as well, heaven is more just like a naturalistic principle, natural law, the pattern that we see operating in and governing the cosmos. He doesn't think of it necessarily as a conscious being or as a personal God. In Confucius, you get more of a sense that heaven is a sovereign deity, even though Confucius does not give us an explicit theology. That's kind of the sense that you get. Heaven has a kind of providence in directing the natural and social worlds, for example. And in Mencius, it's very clear that heaven is the literal source of human morality. But for Xunzi, heaven is important, but it's just because it's the way the universe works. So Confucianism became, in the Han Dynasty, which originated in around the 3rd century BC, became the dominant state philosophy / religion. And it even developed religious aspects during the later Han Dynasty, where they started to build Confucian temples and honor the gods of heaven and earth along Confucian principles. But much later still, there was a revival of Confucianism. Confucianism never completely died out. It did take several hundred years after the life of Confucius. So after the end of the Zhou dynasty during the former Han, when it became the dominant ideology in China. And it never went away. The class of scholars were always mostly influenced by Confucianism, but in later Chinese dynasties, like in the Tang dynasty, Buddhism and religious Taoism had become more predominant. So there was a deliberate attempt to revive Confucianism during the Song, Yuan, and Ming dynasties. And this is called Neo-Confucianism by Western scholars, or Song Ming Rujia in Chinese. So this was a revival of Confucianism and a reaction against the influence of Buddhism and Taoism, but it did actually incorporate some principles or ideas from both Buddhism and Taoism. Like one example of this is the Taoist cosmology, which didn't originate only with Taoism. There was an ancient school of yin-yang theory or naturalistic cosmology that also originated in the later Zhou dynasty, like around the same time as Mencius. But this system of metaphysics and cosmology became especially associated and developed by Taoists. So like the theory of the Dai as the origin of the cosmos. And Confucianism had never had an official cosmology. It wasn't trying to be a complete religious ideology, for example, or even a complete comprehensive naturalistic cosmology necessarily. It was really just trying to focus on morality and politics for most of its history. There were some exceptions. But in any event, the Neo-Confucians were keen to provide a Confucian alternative to Buddhist and Taoist sectarian cosmologies. And so they looked to principles like Dai or the Great Unity as the source of everything. An early example, either the first or a precursor of the Neo-Confucians, was Chong Sai. He was a scholar who started out as a Confucian, then got really into Buddhism and Taoism before finally returning to Confucianism. So that's why he could be influenced by Buddhism and Taoism, even though he was doing it from a Confucian perspective. For example, he taught that all things of our world are composed of qi, or energy. He was not the first Confucian to emphasize qi. Mencius had done that as well, but he created a whole metaphysics or cosmology out of it. So qi, he thought, was in everything, both gross, heavy material things like rock, and also light, airy things like, air or fire. And he just thought of it as energy that was more rare, refined, or more condensed. But it was the same energy, just transforming. So qi is always changing, it's always in flux, it's always mutable, but it follows the patterns of yin and yang. He also thought of qi as not just a kind of dead matter, so to speak, but as vital and self-moving. It was living, maybe like proto-conscious. And the world is not empty, contrary to how it's described in Mahayana Buddhism, where it's described as empty of inherent existence. Rather, it's full of this qi energy. So you can see him reacting against Buddhism there. He did not originate the notion of qi, nor even the idea that all of nature is just transformations of qi, but he developed it, systematized it, and taught it in the context of Confucianism. So Changzai also had a theory of the sage as forming a link between heaven, earth, and humanity. So specifically, the sage is able to connect heaven with the rest of humanity, and that's how it kind of, the conduit goes out across the earth with, if you will, to other human beings. And he taught that the humanity or Ren of a sage is able to encompass the entire world. But contrary to Buddhism and Taoism, which can have a more otherworldly or transcendent ideal of spiritual perfection, like in Buddhism, for example, attaining nirvana is going beyond the state of samsara or conditioned reality, which corresponds, at least in part, to what we ordinarily think of as physical reality. I mean, there's other realms of it as well. But Changzai had this idea of not transcending the world, not abandoning the world or trying to go beyond it, but developing it, perfecting it. So it's a fundamentally more optimistic view about the material world and even the social order of humans. He taught that the world is originally good, which is also unlike Buddhism, although more akin to some versions of Taoism. One of the most important Neo-Confucian philosophers was Chu Shi. His school of thought, his particular version of Confucianism, is known as Li Shui, or the School of Principle. He advocated a new curriculum. Before studying the 5 classics, studying the 4 books, which included the Analects of Confucius and the Book of Mencius, for example. He thought this would be a way of learning the fundamental principles of Confucian ethics and overall philosophy more directly. And then it would be preparing a person to study the 5 classics and interpret them using Confucian principles. So the 4 books curriculum is still the standard Confucian curriculum that would be undertaken before studying the 5 classics. He also taught that Ren, or humanity, can only be attained after a long process of ethical self-cultivation. So he agreed with Mencius, who became, by the way, the most important Confucian philosopher for the Neo-Confucians after Confucius himself. They adopted his more optimistic view of human nature rather than the more pessimistic view of Xunzi. Chu Shi thought that human nature has a tendency towards goodness, but he thought that it was still a long and difficult process to develop yourself to attaining humanity or Ren. And he also taught this concept of Go Wu, or examination of things, which is a method for ethical self-cultivation. So he thought that in order to become a good person, you have to actually expand your knowledge through examination and study. This includes both knowledge of yourself. You could think of it as knowing the sort of quirks of your ways of thinking and feeling, which is kind of obviously or intuitively related to morality and moral self-development, but also studying the world and how it works. You have to have a kind of knowledge in order to be moral, according to Chu Shi. And that fits very well with the kind of scholarly or scholastic orientation of Confucianism. But he also borrowed or introduced a form of meditation called Jing Zuo, quiet sitting, into Confucianism. Now, Confucianism before this time had a sort of meditation practice of reading the classics with a very contemplative frame of mind. This is similar to the Catholic Christian practice of Lectio Divina, reading the Bible in a kind of contemplative frame of mind. But there was no, hitherto before Chu Shi, a type of Confucian meditation that was similar to those used by Taoism and Buddhism. But the quiet sitting specifically is similar to the sitting forgetting meditation technique, which goes back to ancient Taoism like Chuang-Tzu, and also the just sitting meditation technique of Chan Buddhism, or the meditation school from Chinese Buddhism. So you can see Chu Shi and other Neo-Confucians are trying to make Confucianism a rival and competitor, both as a religion and as an overall worldview to Buddhism and Taoism. And here's another quote. Here's a quotation from Chu Shi. Quote, "The mind of heaven and earth, which gives birth to all things, is humanity, or Ren. Man, in being endowed with matter or energy, Qi, receives this mind of heaven and earth, and thereby his life. Hence, tender-heartedness and humanity, Ren, are the very essence of his life." End quote. The significance of this is that it is expressing that optimistic idea that human nature is given something by heaven. It's given this principle of humanity. We already have it within us. We just need to deliberately cultivate it and develop it through education, through examination of things. So he's definitely leaning more towards Mencius in his view of human nature than Xunzi. Wang Yangming was another very influential later Neo-Confucian. His particular take on Confucian thought is called Xin Shui, or the School of Mind. And in his view, he's even more optimistic than Chu Shi was. Heavenly principle, or Li, which is something we're inborn with, is even more important than learning, or Shui, according to Wang Yangming. So this is almost reversing the Confucian idea that we have to study and exert deliberate effort and to correct our nature through ritual and ceremony for years or even decades before we can develop humanity or goodness. This is a much more optimistic view of human nature. It is at least broadly compatible with Confucianism in general, because he still acknowledges a role for Confucian learning, or Shui. But in its emphasis on the innate goodness of humans, it actually reflects or is similar to the Taoist idea of the natural perfection, this sometimes called the uncarved block, that human nature is originally good and it's only corrupted by individual selfishness or society. And the Chinese Buddhist notion of the Buddha nature that we already have within us, and that we can just get rid of adventitious defilements and reveal. So it's almost as if human nature is naturally aligning with heaven, and all we have to do is get rid of these few kind of defiling emotions or deranged chi, and then with a little bit of learning, and then we'll be fine. So a bit more about that 4 books curriculum that was advocated by Chu Shi and has been used by Confucians ever since. The first one is the Da Shui, or the Great Learning. This is a short text. It emerged as a part of a longer work, but here it's presented on its own because it basically gives a justification for the Confucian learning curriculum. The idea is, in order to perfect all of society, you have to start on the smaller level of perfecting yourself. And when you do that, you can benefit your family can benefit your village can benefit your locale, etc., until it kind of like ripples outward to all of society and even all of Earth. But in order to cultivate yourself, you have to start with learning. The second of the 4 books is the Analects of Confucius, the collected or ordered sayings. And these are basically the words of Confucius that were preserved by his later followers. There's also some analects that have things that his main disciples or followers said. And these are often very short. And so Confucius would make a little point, maybe like with a pithy expression or saying, and the Analects, like a lot of other Confucian classics, were usually read along with a commentary that kind of expands on the original context of the text to give you its meaning and sort of draws out the deeper moral message or political message that is there. The third of the four books is the book of Mencius, or the Mengzi, which is just named after the author. So this is the main teachings of the Confucian Mencius, such as the four sprouts of virtue, etc. And then the fourth of the four books is another short one, the Doctrine of the Mean, or Chongyong. So it gives kind of like the beginnings of practical advice on how to start applying Confucian moral principles in self and society. So now let's move on to part 4, Taoism. Taoism is often regarded by Taoists themselves as being older than Confucius, maybe even having a primordial beginning in thousands or tens of thousands of years BC at the very start of Chinese civilization. But historically speaking, it probably was a later school of thought that actually emerged in large part as a reaction against Confucianism by some scholars who had different ideas. So, for example, it prioritizes what you could call the way of nature. Tao, which is where the tradition gets its name from, means way or path. But they prioritize the way of nature, or you could just say the way of the world, the cosmos, over the way of human society and custom. So this is unlike Confucius, who admires to a great degree the customs of the Zhou kings. And Confucius is more optimistic about the virtues and benefits and wisdom that is encoded in human culture and society. Whereas Taoists, at least the more philosophically inclined, tend to be a bit more, in a way, skeptical or doubtful or less idealizing of human culture. That human culture can actually have a bunch of disturbed aspects in it that get us out of line with the way of things. The Taoist philosophers emphasize as well receptivity versus assertion. So not just trying to force the world or force society to operate in a certain way, but to work with the natural forces with a kind of light touch. And there's also, from the very beginning, a kind of mystical side of Taoism, which kind of insists that the ultimate nature of the Tao cannot be put into words or cannot even be embodied in human form that you could just imitate, unlike the Confucian idea that you can at least follow the ancient kings as moral role models or exemplars. There's more of the idea in Taoism, you have to get some intuitive mystical understanding of the Tao in order to act in harmony with it. So the Tao, as mentioned, means the way of nature or the way of things. It's often associated with emptiness or Wu Ji, the supreme primordial emptiness from which the rest of the cosmos emerged. A lot of the philosophy of the Tao is spelled out in the Tao Te Ching, the oldest known Taoist work, but also in later texts. And the Tao Te Ching itself gives a simplified cosmogony or origin of the cosmos. It starts with this emptiness, which is kind of identified with the Tao. Out of the emptiness comes a oneness or a unity, which you can identify with the great ultimate Dai Ji. Out of the oneness comes a two-ness, which would be interpreted as yin and yang, or earth and heaven. And then there's the three, which especially later on would be interpreted as the trinity of heaven, earth, and humanity. That was a theme of both Confucian and Taoist texts. And then you get everything else, essentially, the 10,000 things or the myriad phenomena. These are the countless phenomena that we can experience with the senses that make up the world as we ordinarily see it. So for the Taoists, the Tao is not directly perceptible. Only the 10,000 things are. But you can kind of intuitively or perhaps mystically sense and detect the real operation of the Tao behind the scenes, governing the course of changes of yin and yang and other natural forces. So according to tradition, the founder of Taoism was Lao Tzu, who was an older contemporary of Confucius who lived in the 6th century BC. In actual fact, Lao Tzu, which means the old master, was probably not a real person, but a kind of fictional author whose name was appended to the oldest Taoist philosophical text, Tao Te Ching, or Way Power Classic. So the main themes of the Tao Te Ching, which is also known as the Lao Tzu or the Book of Lao Tzu, are anti-Confucian. There's a line, for example, of the Tao Te Ching which says that the sage or the wise person is not humane or ren, directly contradicting Confucianism. The idea here is not that the sage is supposed to be, vicious or cruel or the opposite of humane. Rather, in Taoism, there's a notion that the Confucian virtues like humaneness, uprightness, filial piety, etc., are false adornments. They're things that are artificial constructs that society might create or a person might strive for, but they will take you out of harmony with the deeper way of the universe. So you can't paradoxically obtain genuine virtue through deliberately trying to copy virtuous role models or study texts that describe virtue, or even thinking of yourself as virtuous or deliberately endeavoring to become virtuous. Rather, that's sort of putting the cart before the horse. You have to get in some kind of harmony or connection with the deeper pattern of the forces of nature and ultimately of the Tao itself, and then you will kind of become virtuous that way. The Tao is supposed to transcend the forces of nature and transcend heaven and earth, yang and yin. But in the Tao Te Ching, it is described more commonly using yin imagery rather. So yin, apart from just being dark or shadowy, is associated with many other principles, like the female, like the element water and earth, like the low position, like being receptive, hollow, empty, etc. Whereas yang is associated with the opposite of all those, with brightness, with heat, with the male, with the high position, with heaven and fire and mountaintops and so on. So why would the Tao, if it transcends both yin and yang, be described primarily using yin imagery? Well, it's probably because the Tao is like yin and that it is shadowy and mysterious. We cannot directly perceive it with the senses or even the intellect, and so it has to be perceived indirectly through some type of intuition. And there's different views of Taoists about how you develop this, but a common view is that it does involve interacting with the world, but just not in a forceful or overly deliberate or direct way. There has to be a kind of careful awareness and sensitivity to the ever-changing fabric of yin and yang in the cosmos. So the term wu wei, or non-action, not doing, is used in the Tao Te Ching and other early Taoist texts to talk about a type of spontaneous or non-forced, non-deliberate action. So a sage or wise person is not just passive, they do act. Sometimes they act very quickly, but they're doing it in a way that's not forceful, that's in harmony with the Tao or the way of things. And so it's actually more effective action. Lao Tzu was originally regarded as a human philosopher or sage, and he's also worshipped as a god by religious Taoists. First of all, there are human sages in general, regarded as immortals or just beings worthy of worship in Taoism and Chinese folk religion. But there are Taoist sects that specifically think of Lao Tzu as a heavenly sovereign ruling over everything from a heavenly throne. or as a human incarnation of the Tao. The latter idea being showing the influence of later Buddhist thought of incarnations of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Another figure from early Taoism is King Mu of Zhou. So he was apparently an actual historical king of the Zhou dynasty, but the Taoist connection is mainly about his legendary side, which is told in the tale of King Mu, son of heaven. In this story, he wants to visit the western paradise of Kunlun to eat the peaches of immortality of that goddess Shi Wang Mu. And he is able to get there after a long journey, in part through the efforts of a skilled charioteer named Zhao Fu. So this is showing you the sort of religious, mythological side of Taoism that at a certain point in the later Zhou dynasty and really in the Han dynasty gets interwoven with philosophical Taoism. Another ancient Taoist philosopher, though, is Chuang-Tzu. And unlike Lao Tzu, he was a historical person. He was apparently a scholar official who had a post in the government in the state of Chu. He's an author of the book known as the Chuang-Tzu, just named after him. There's a lot of ideas in the Chuang-Tzu, and you could say it's broadly aligned with the Tao Te Ching, but the style is completely different. The Tao Te Ching is more abstract, mystical, philosophical, has like little proverbs or short snippets, whereas the Chuang-Tzu has short stories. It's more playful and literary. And even there are other people mentioned, for example, that were friends of Chuang-Tzu, unlike the Tao Te Ching, which doesn't personalize things in that way. So one of the concepts described in the Chuang-Tzu could be called relativity of perspective. So the first book of the Chuang-Tzu actually starts with this image of this giant bird that, as part of traditional Chinese mythology or belief, the peng bird, and it's so huge, it's able to fly up into the highest part of heaven. And other lesser birds look at it and they actually make fun of it. They're like, what is this guy? What does he think he's doing? Why would you fly that high? That's dumb. And so this illustrates this concept of the relativity of perspective, that different beings, different humans, but also different creatures, are going to view things in different ways and may find it difficult or even almost impossible to understand the other perspective. This is often interpreted by scholars as evidence that Chuang-Tzu, the philosopher, was a relativist, that, oh, everyone has their own perspective and the way they perceive things is what's true for them. But this is probably not true, at least not the complete picture, because there's a deeper message in the Chuang-Tzu as well, that even though different beings have their own perspective, some perspectives are larger than others. So like in the very story of the peng bird, that bird flies all the way to heaven, and that bird is able to see all the earth from its perspective. Whereas the smaller birds, they're more limited in their view. They can't see everything. And so their lack of understanding is more of an indictment of their own narrow, small perspective. The peng bird is a symbol of a sage or a wise person who transcends the normal, petty, you might say socially constructed or individually ego-constructed views of most other humans. So that is a very Taoist idea, that there is a cosmic, natural way that if you're able to attain it, you will see things from a broader perspective. There's also a notion of change or transformation as being inevitable, but unlike in Buddhism, where the impermanence of things is regarded as a negative and why you should not be attached to things and why you should want to try to transcend the world of impermanence, samsara, and attain nirvana, rather in Chuang-Tzu's view, the changes of nature should be embraced in order to escape suffering from them. For example, there's a scene where he's describing the death of his wife, which hit him very hard, but he then is celebrating and singing, not because he hated his wife and happy she's dead, but just because he has this deeper wisdom that even in the face of the biggest loss, you have to just embrace it. It's all part of this flow of the Tao, flow of phenomena. He does briefly describe what appear to be meditation techniques, including one called sitting forgetting. And this probably had an influence on later Taoist meditation techniques. There were Taoists practicing meditation in China even before Buddhism and Buddhist meditation was introduced. And you can probably see references to this, although they're indirect, in the Tao Te Ching as well. So the Chuang-Tzu has a lot to say about a Chunrun, which is the Taoist way of talking about a sage or a supremely wise person. It can mean a true person or someone who is spiritually perfected. So this is the Taoist ideal. It's similar to the Confucian idea of becoming a sage through self-cultivation. But in Taoism, they have different views about the nature of self-cultivation. For example, it can involve sitting forgetting meditation, unlike the original Confucian view, which is more focused on just study and ritual. And also, the Taoist sage is not just a transmitter or perfecter of human culture. They are attaining this transcendent cosmic perspective. And so they might appear sort of weird or strange or befuddling to non-perfected persons. The Chuang-Tzu also contains a somewhat gentle, playful, but still serious critique of another philosopher, Liezi, who is probably a friend or some kind of companion of Chuang-Tzu. Liezi, among other things, taught a doctrine of oneness, that all things in nature are one being. Interestingly, he tried to show this through a series of paradoxes, some of which are quite analogous to the paradoxes of Zeno, an ancient Greek philosopher, who likewise developed these paradoxes to prove the metaphysical principle of his own teacher Parmenides, that all things are one being. As far as I know, these were developed completely independently of each other in the ancient Greek and ancient Chinese philosophical traditions, respectively. But it does show you that there are certain philosophical theories and arguments and concepts that tend to be discovered or developed independently by different human cultures. So Chuang-Tzu, he agrees in a part with Liezi. There's a kind of unity to things, but he thinks that Liezi is just wrong, that everything is literally one. One of the playful arguments he gives against this is that when you say everything is one or all is one being, there's a difference already created right there between the being of everything and the saying that everything is one. So he's saying, in modern terms, we might say there's a difference between the proposition or the statement about reality and the reality itself. So if propositions are real, they're distinct in being from what they're about. And so there's at least two realities right there. And then he gives some other examples that rapidly multiply the number of things. So Chuang-Tzu thinks that things are many, myriad, countless, far from being one, but also he does seem to agree that there's a kind of unity or harmony of things. And this would correspond to the idea of the Tao that was also discussed by other Taoist philosophers. So the Tao is the kind of source and the governor of the many. They all obey its principles, so it imposes a kind of structural unity among the many. By the way, for both Lao Tzu and Chuang-Tzu, they were writing their philosophy before Taoism existed as a named entity. It was actually named by a later Chinese historian. However, the term is fitting because there really were common philosophical themes in several ancient texts, including the Tao Te Ching and the Chuang-Tzu. So the later identification of them with the Taoist school of thought is not just, wholly inaccurate or arbitrary. The picture on the slide shows another famous story from the Chuang-Tzu, where Chuang-Tzu briefly refers to awaking from a dream, and in the dream he had thought that he was a butterfly, sort of floating, fluttering around. But when he awakes from the dream, he then wonders, wait, am I Chuang-Tzu dreaming that I was a butterfly, or am I actually a butterfly now dreaming that I'm Chuang-Tzu? That is a kind of playful way of indicating that relativity of perspective, but also just the Taoist notion of trying to get us outside of our usual ways of thinking, including those that were transmitted by society, to see a broader or more cosmic perspective. There's another aspect of Taoism not really discussed by the textbook, alchemy or dawn. Don means cinnabar, which is mercury cyanide, a toxic compound of mercury. But mercury is an important metal used in Chinese alchemy, um, as well as in Western alchemy. As far as I know, Western alchemy developed originally in Egypt, and it was separate from Chinese alchemy. In fact, the Western alchemy was originally mainly focused on transmuting base metals into gold, and the Chinese alchemy was focused on developing immortality, even though they also believed you could affect material transformations as well. And I've heard people claim, I don't know if it's true, I'm not an expert on this, but I've heard at least some scholars claim that the Western idea that the Philosopher's Stone could make you immortal actually shows the influence of Chinese alchemy, which was somehow transmitted westward, perhaps on the Silk Road in the Middle Ages. I don't know if that's true, but people have said that. In any event, the alchemy in Chinese tradition developed kind of originally outside of Taoism, but in the ancient period was incorporated into it and became most associated with religious Taoism. There are two main types of Taoist alchemy, though, outer and inner. Outer is the type of alchemy that involves manipulation of actual physical materials, where you create a potion or elixir of immortality that if you drink it makes you immortal. Ironically, because some of these potions had mercury in them, some people who would drink them would actually poison themselves, thus hastening their demise rather than prolonging their life. And that is said to have been the case for the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, for example. Also practiced, though, is Neidan, or inner alchemy, which is where you transmute or transform your inner energies, your inner nature, through meditation practices. The image on the slide is from a modern work that shows a Taoist in meditation developing their spirit embryo, which is immortal and immortal true self that we already have within us that can be nourished and nurtured. And it is pure shun, or pure spirit. And when we develop that, we can eventually have that spiritual body, which is immortal, replace our physical body and become a Taoist immortal. So the idea of immortality is not necessarily regarded as an easy to attain goal. It's like the wisest sages in the history of Taoism have transcended to that level. But there is this general idea in Taoism of both self-cultivation and also of knowing special techniques that could give you mystical or magical powers. And the latter idea in ancient times was referred to as Feng Xian Dao, or the way Dao of methods, Feng, and immortality, Xian. The people who practiced this were called Feng Shi, masters of the methods. The methods could refer to literal alchemical recipes for making potions, but also other types of methods like divination, astrology. These people used the Yi Jing. They did create alchemical potions. They also use herbs and massage to cure illnesses. And they had spells and talismans, or fulu, to provide protection and healing for people. And the use of talismans is still a part of modern religious Taoism, as are some of these other practices, including shamanism or spirit mediumship. So this is, common to all ancient human cultures. If you go back far enough in history, most of them were animistic in terms of religion, and most of those animistic religions had shamans. Not all, but most. So ancient Chinese religion had these spiritual experts who would become possessed with, or at least communicate with, gods and spirits. And they could heal people, they could perform divinations, they could drive out harmful spirits, exorcisms, etc. And this is still a part of some religious Taoism today. Not all sects of Taoism do this, and not all temples, but some traditions do, where individuals in the community will have a kind of personal spiritual relationship, you could say, with a particular god or goddess. Typically, that's how it works. There's only one that they will kind of manifest. And when they're at temple and they go into a certain ceremony of song and dance, usually it's like a rhythmic drumming and chanting and playing of bells or cymbals and stuff. They kind of sway around, and then they get possessed by the god or goddess. They're dressed as the god or goddess. They adopt its external mannerisms and features, and then they will have people come to them with their problems and they will answer them or solve them. And so even though this Fengxian Dao is kind of like an ancient tradition, most of these practices are still alive today in religious Taoism. In antiquity, there were several different Taoist sects. These emerged in the latter part of the Han Dynasty, for the most part, or towards the switchover between the earlier and the later Han Dynasty. So this is the first couple of centuries AD. Now, uh, both of these sects no longer exist, but Celestial Masters is kind of like the ancestor or founder of a tradition, Chengyi Dao, that is still around and has modern Taoist sects that identify with it. Celestial Masters, or Tianxi Dao, the way literally of the heavenly Tian Masters, Xi, was founded by Chang Daoling, who, according to their tradition, received a revelation from Lao Tzu. In Taoism, it's common for founders of sects to claim to have had a mystical visionary experience where they either ascend to heaven or otherwise have some kind of vision of an ancestor or a god giving them new teachings and telling them how to practice rituals and so on. So one of the innovations of Tianxi Dao was they rejected animal sacrifice to the gods. They also developed their own elaborate system of the celestial bureaucracy. So this is apparently where that idea became fused with Taoist principles. And it's still a part of Taoist sects today, that there's a whole elaborate pantheon of gods, goddesses, spirits, and you have to know what office or bureau each god is in to know who to go to solve your problem. They did make use of the talismans or fulu, and there was also a political dimension to Tianxi Dao. They had a state in the south of China, Shu, where it was ruled by priests, so it had a theocratic form of government. Eventually, though, their state was destroyed by the famous general Cao Cao towards the end of the Eastern Han Dynasty. So that was the end of the Celestial Masters, but their teachings are known as Chengyi Dao, or the way of orthodox unity. And like I said, they are still advocated or believed in by some modern Taoist sects. The other prominent ancient Taoist sect is Daiping Dao, the way of great peace. And this was founded by three brothers named Chang in what's now Shandong province during the Han Dynasty. So their teachings were based on a work called the Daiping Jing, the classic of great peace. And among other things, this work taught that there's a kind of cosmic cycle of the five elements. Just as, according to ancient Chinese philosophy, the elements will naturally transform into one another through a kind of specific process. There's both a generating process where one element generates or nourishes another, like for example, earth nourishes metal. But there's also an overcoming process where one element will cancel, destroy, or overcome another. So according to the overcoming cycle, the water element will be overcome by earth. And this is because you can use earth to actually dam up rivers, which are made of water. So the Han Dynasty, according to this elemental cosmology or cosmic cycle theory, was associated with the Han Dynasty. And so its era of water was going to be replaced by an era of earth. And the Taiping Dao movement associated themselves with the earth element, which in Chinese cosmology is associated with the color yellow, as well as associated with the center of China. And this is because the Yellow River gets that color from the yellow loess, the fine silt or soil from the loess plateau. And so that's why yellow is used both as a symbol of earth, but also for the sort of like center of the world, the element earth and the center of the world from the Chinese perspective. So a lot of the followers of Daiping Dao wore yellow to symbolize their allegiance, and they rebelled against the Han Dynasty in 184 AD. And they thought that they would be supported by the cosmos to overthrow the Han, but their rebellion was actually crushed, and their movement ended then and there. The main later Taoist sects were Chuanchen, Complete Truth, and Chengyi Dao, Orthodox Unity. These are from a later period, about 1,000 years after the Han Dynasty we were previously discussing with the earlier Taoist sects. Chuanchen was founded by Wang Chongyang, and this is an example of a Taoist sect that had or has monks. So there was an ancient Taoist tradition of Taoist hermits before Buddhism even entered China. So there were some Taoists who would retire from government or from city life and live out in the countryside or even in the wilderness all by themselves and live a very simple existence, trying to get in harmony with the Tao, so to speak, practicing meditation, perhaps eating a grain-free diet, which was another ancient Taoist practice. And they would live very simply. They practiced asceticism and eremiticism. But this was before Buddhism came. And after Buddhism came, some Taoist sects adopted monasticism, i.e., Taoist ascetics living together in communities that followed a common rule or code of conduct. And that was new to Taoism. The Chuanchen sect also taught the goal of spiritual transcendence through inner alchemy rather than attaining a physical immortality. And they were somewhat syncretic, so in addition to using the Tao Te Ching as one of their main scriptures, they advocated the use of the Confucian text, the Classic of Filiality, or Xiao, and the Buddhist Heart Sutra as well. The founder, Wang Chongyang, had 7 main disciples called the Seven Perfected, who were also regarded as sages like him. There was also Sun Bu-er, who is the wife of his disciple Ma Danyang, and she's a rare example of a female Taoist sage. There are women who practice Taoist self-cultivation techniques as well. And at first, though, her husband and Wang Chongyang were reluctant to give her permission to leave home to develop her spiritual training more. But, and the excuse that Ma Danyang used was that she was too beautiful. So if she left home, she'd be accosted by unvirtuous men and assaulted. And in order to get around this objection, she actually burned her face severely with hot oil in order to disfigure herself. And that act, showing great determination, convinced Wang Chongyang and Ma Danyang to let her go. But according to the story, when she was on her way going through the countryside to another town, she was still accosted by unethical men, but she had such mystic powers she was able to escape them. This is also a belief in Taoism that if you are a master of qi, you can do miraculous or magical things. The other main sect of later Taoism was Chengyi Dao. So this sect actually originates in the Yuan dynasty, or in any event, that's when it got this sort of like official status to govern other types of Taoists. They compiled the official Taoist canon of scriptures, the Tao Song, for example, in 1445. The Mongol emperors of China during the Yuan dynasty, they themselves were Vajrayana Buddhist, but they also supported Orthodox Unity Taoism, partly as a way of, showing they were accepting Chinese culture. It was a way of just kind of fitting in more with the, kind of like the ideology of the scholarly class and the general culture and so on. So this made Chengyi Dao one of the most prominent Taoist sects ever after. They regard themselves as the successors to the ancient celestial masters. And even after the Yuan dynasty ended, the Mongols were kicked out. They still retained that precedence among Taoist sects. And finally, part 5, syncretism and modernity. So, Dao Qian was a scholar official of the Eastern Han Dynasty, or the later Han Dynasty. and he retired from his government position to become a poet or recluse. This was a common pattern in ancient Chinese philosophers or sages. They were generally from the educated class of scholar officials, but many of them didn't have time to write philosophy or to do poetry or art when they were working for government. And so it was only after they retired that they could focus on that. But also, a lot of them would retire because they were disgusted with the corruption or the politics that they were exposed to. And so they retired as a deliberate decision to pursue a different way of life. So that's part of the story, at least the traditional account, of Dao Jian. He's also known as Dao Yuan Ming, by the way. So this is an interesting example of syncretism, or combining different religious traditions, which is frequently done in China. So if you look at most of Chinese history, most people practice a combination of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and they didn't see a necessary conflict between them. Now, this wasn't true for everyone at all times. There were some people who only followed one of those traditions, and there were some people, including some emperors, who persecuted traditions that they didn't like or they thought of as destructive. But for the most part, all three of these were combined, and Dao Jian is a good example of that. So these are some examples of how he was influenced by the three traditions. He studied very deeply the six classics, especially when he was younger, of Confucianism. Like Taoists, though, he desired to return to a simpler life in a village or closer to nature, and that was connected with the story that he retired from government. And this quotation shows the Buddhist influence on his thought. Quote, "Life is like an illusion. Everything returns to emptiness." End quote. So these three facts show you right there that he's actually being influenced by all three traditions. And even though he's an example of this at the elite or scholarly level, this was also done, practically speaking, by many Chinese who might go, for example, to all three kinds of temples. Another example of religious syncretism from Chinese religion is Lin Chao-en, who sought to harmonize the San Jiao, or the three traditions, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. So the way this is often done in Chinese culture generally, and this is also visible in the thought of Lin Chao-en, is that Confucianism is thought of as mainly applying at the level of family and social morality, and at political philosophy, and in religious ceremonies. So that's what you go to Confucianism to learn about or to practice. Whereas Taoism, even though it does have its own ceremonies too, it can be combined with Confucianism. So like Taoist meditation or other health and longevity practices, and Taoist gods and goddesses like Lao Tzu or Shi Wang Mu, those can be worshipped alongside practicing the Confucian virtues of Xiao and Ren, for example. And then Buddhism is mainly focused, at least in traditional Chinese culture, on death and the afterlife, because Buddhism was the religion that introduced the belief in reincarnation, and that you have this whole this whole future in front of you after death. It doesn't just end. There isn't just a simple afterlife. Your destiny will be determined by the state of your being, so to speak, after death. So what world you're born into. Are you going to be reborn as a ghost, or into hell, or a heaven, or will you attain nirvana? All this kind of thing. So Buddhism in traditional Chinese culture was very much associated with death, the afterlife, and it became associated with ancestor worship. Even though ancestor worship is part of the very oldest forms of Chinese religion and was in China far before the entry of Buddhism, for over 1,000 years, probably more like 2,000 years. Nevertheless, it became especially associated with Buddhism because there are many Buddhas who are regarded as protectors of those who passed on to the next life. And there are Buddhist theories of where the ancestors go to. So it became natural to incorporate ancestor worship into Buddhist ceremonies specifically. By the way, in the picture you see the Buddha, the Lao Tzu, and Confucius shown together, illustrating the idea of the Sanjiao. So it's the elder Lao Tzu, the slightly younger Confucius, holding the infant Buddha. The imperial system of government in China had lasted for thousands of years. It finally ended in 1912, and the Republic of China, or ROC, was established. The imperial government came to an end for a variety of reasons. Basically, they failed to modernize and to increase their military power sufficient to deter first Western imperialists who took control in parts of some of their cities and forced concessions from them. And later on in the 1890s, they lost a war with Japan, the first Sino-Japanese War. And that kind of proved that the imperial system of government was not doing a good job running China and couldn't protect it from its enemies. Unfortunately, the Republic of China, which did last until 1949, but it was very weak, and the country was quickly divided between different warlords, and as well, they were invaded again starting in 1931 by Japan. Japan occupied the northeastern province of Manchuria, and later on occupied many other territories in eastern and southern China, right through World War II, and the Japanese occupation only ended in 1945. During this time, there was not even a unified effort against the Japanese. There was a civil war between the nationalists, or Kuomintang, or the KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP. The Communists won the Civil War after the end of World War II in the year 1949. The nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan and continued the Republic of China there, where it still exists as a separate nation, or at least a de facto separate government to this day. So we can't really cover all the detailed, controversial history and politics, but just to set the stage that this was a very turbulent period of Chinese history. And there were changes to the religion happening as well. So on the one hand, traditional Chinese religion does still survive, but it's much less commonly practiced today than it was, say, at the beginning of the Republic of China period. All the wars, all the destructions, but also the victory of communist ideology in mainland China, and just modernization, which does seem to lead to declining religiosity everywhere, such as in Western cultures, all of those had an impact on the decline of traditional Chinese religion. So in particular, in China, under the People's Republic of China that was established by the Communist Party after their victory in the Civil War, their government suppressed a lot of religions due to Marxist ideology, which regards religion as basically a tool of the capitalist class to exploit, or to help the exploitation of the working class by giving them false hope. So in particular, the head of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, and the first leader of People's Republic of China, he was very critical of all of the traditional religions, but especially Confucianism, which he thought had pervaded Chinese culture and was anti-Marxist and so needed to be annihilated. Mao Zedong did help unify the country. So the Civil War ended, things were, much less chaotic than previously, but the communist policies did have negative effects too. The Great Leap Forward in the 1950s caused a famine and led to millions of deaths. So we won't get into all the controversial politics and history. It's difficult to summarize without angering folks, but those are the facts as they're generally agreed upon. So religion was being suppressed by Mao, especially Confucianism and Confucian philosophy and just the culture of Confucianism. But things increased even more during the Cultural Revolution, which was towards the end of Mao's rule and in the immediate aftermath of that as well, the years 1966 and 1976. Mao started the Cultural Revolution because he thought that the Communist Revolution, which had seized political power, had not yet completely transformed Chinese culture and gotten rid of all the old pre-Marxist, pre-communist ways of thinking. So he wanted to try to forcefully annihilate those as much as possible. During the Cultural Revolution, a lot of Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist temples were destroyed, and a lot of the books were burned, as you can see in this photograph of Buddhist books being burned in the streets. There were a lot of Buddhist and Taoist monks that were driven away from their temples or monasteries and forced to become lay people. A lot of people died, became political prisoners, were tortured. It was a very violent, destructive period. And it wasn't just religion, but even just Chinese history, tradition, and culture that were attacked. It was a very chaotic period. And after the death of Mao Zedong, eventually Deng Xiaoping became the leader of China. And he brought an end to the Cultural Revolution, but also made some reforms, some small reforms to the economy that gave people more economic freedom, allowing more businesses to form, buying and selling. This was a huge part of the later industrialization, economic development of China. Now it's either the largest or the second largest economy in the world. And he also decrease the oppression of religion. So there are still controls on religion in China. Religion is often thought of as politically dangerous because some sects have ideologies that are regarded as negative or harmful to the regime. And for example, the bishops in the Catholic Church in China are appointed by the Communist Party, not by the Pope or the Church itself. So there are a lot of controls on religions. There's only certain religions that are acknowledged or authorized by the government, but nevertheless, there's much more religious freedom now in China than there was during the Cultural Revolution. So there's actually been somewhat of a revival, at least at the margin, of Chinese folk religion, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Most or many Chinese don't regard themselves as religious, but even those who don't regard themselves as religious may still practice traditional ancestor worship or occasionally pray at temples for luck, festivals, or just at other times. So there is still the traditional religion kind of infused in the culture. And there's even been government-sponsored revival of Confucianism as part of a reappraisal of traditional Chinese culture, viewing it as a good thing, as something to be proud of. And the government has even rebuilt some Buddhist and Taoist temples, although oftentimes they are being recreated as museums or like tourist spots. So that's kind of the current state of religion in China. In addition to traditional Chinese religions being still somewhat practiced, there's also Islam, Christianity, and there's also some other like ethnic or animistic religions practiced by some minorities in various places, and forms of Tibetan Buddhism and of Mongolian shamanism and little things like that. But for the most part, China is pretty secular. The traditional religions are nowhere near as common as they used to be, but they are still there, and they're actually more prominent in southern China as well. So this is a map. Sorry about the poor resolution, but it was the best that I could find. County by county survey of the most dominant religion. So it shows you more fine-grained where certain religions tend to be concentrated. Keep in mind that if a county is shown as one color, it does not mean that only that religion is practiced there, but just that it is the most common religion practiced in that part of China. So you can see large parts of China are yellow or Buddhist. One thing to keep in mind is that the Western Buddhism in Tibet is of a different type than that practice in the rest of China. So Tibetan Buddhism is Vajrayana. They have their own scriptures and practices, whereas in the East, it's the traditional Chinese forms of Buddhism, like Pure Land and Chan and so on. You also see many spots of Protestant Christianity, some spots of Catholic Christianity, large parts of Islam, especially in the west around Xinjiang or East Turkestan. Keep in mind that even though Islam is the dominant religion in large parts of the West, Western China is much less populated than Eastern China. the population density is much lower. So the total population of Muslims in China is actually much lower than that of Buddhists, for example. You also see in blue little pockets where Taoism and folk religion is most common, and other areas where there's no single religion that's dominant. Well, that's going to finish up our summary of Chinese religions. Next up, we're going to do a chapter on Sinkyo, Korea's traditional religion. See you next time.